Twitter and Facebook have over several years now failed to fully step up to their responsibilities. And that is both about restricting speech, but also about amplifying speech.
You can actually suppress freedom of speech if you allow abuse and toxicity to run rampant.
If that is the path that this publisher is deciding it will go down, then it needs to be consistent.
Plus, why one of Australia's natural wonders is under threat.
And it'll probably happen fairly quickly. It could be grim. Yeah, it could be grim.
Until last week, Donald Trump had one of the world's biggest social media audiences. But after last week's unrest in the US Capitol, Twitter and several other tech companies took the extraordinary step of suspending his account, fearing the risk of further violence. Now, their decisions have sparked a wider debate about social media companies and their responsibility for the content they host. The focus has now shifted in Australia to how social media platforms can and should be regulated. Paul Farrell reports.
You shall be saved. In the kingdom of God.
Last week, amid ugly scenes of unrest in the United States Capitol, the world's tech giants silenced one of their most prolific and controversial users.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Twitter and Facebook deleted President Donald Trump's extensive social media profiles after a violent mob stormed the US Capitol. Twitter based its permanent suspension on 2 tweets from the president where he said his supporters would not be disrespected. It said the posts were highly likely to lead to further violent acts.
They were being interpreted as an invitation and permission and encouragement to continue to stop the steal, as they say. That is, contest the election. That is at the heart of the motivation for the violence.
Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg said the social media giant's decision to cancel Donald Trump's account for at least 2 weeks was based on his use of the platform to incite violent insurrection.
You can actually suppress freedom of speech if you allow abuse and toxicity to run rampant.
The actions taken by these powerful companies are worlds apart from their past defence of their platforms. They're seen by many as a turning point for these tech giants, which have for years been criticised for playing a far too passive role in moderating violent and abusive rhetoric and disinformation.
Twitter and Facebook have over several years now failed to fully step up to their responsibility as publishers. And that is both about restricting speech, but also about amplifying speech.
Twitter told 730 in a statement that it enforced its policies equally and impartially. Facebook said it actively sought to address harmful content on its platform.
We've fought 2 world wars to make sure that freedom of speech is something that is the hallmark of our democracy. There is some sort of decency that needs to be affected on Twitter, but I'm not in favour of censorship.
In Australia, government ministers and backbenchers have publicly criticised the social media giants' infringement of freedom of speech and the power they wield to shut down users.
Well, I felt pretty uncomfortable with those measures that were announced. Freedom of speech is fundamental to our society.
So I can only think those Australian politicians who are saying Twitter did the wrong thing are not aware of what was actually going on. Exactly as Twitter said, the president's statements were being taken by his supporters as an invitation to plan further violence. I'm not sure what else Twitter was meant to do in that set of circumstances.
I think it's a big deal to be taking someone off a platform like Twitter who's the President of the United States. And so if that is the path that this publisher is deciding it will go down, then it needs to be consistent.
Of course, it's not about his freedom of speech. It's about the fact that he can't be trusted not to incite violence.
Social media companies operate within a different legal framework to other media. In the United States and in Australia, social media platforms enjoy a special legal immunity for content that is published on their sites. That immunity drastically limits their liability as publishers in the same way that newspapers or others might be for their own content.
What I think we've seen over time, it's very clear to the general public as well as the platforms how their technologies have been weaponized. They're well aware of what the harms have been. What I really think is important is that we look at the current rules on the books objectively.
Australia's eSafety Commissioner Julia Inman worked in Silicon Valley for years. She sees daily the challenges in managing content on social media platforms.
One of our major concerns with the platforms is that they're not always consistently and fairly enforcing their own policies. And of course, there are particular challenges when you're doing that with a head of state.
There is no doubt that the platforms are hosting material which could incite violence and is also defamatory. There's no doubt about that. Now, the trick is, though, they will need to be consistent in the application of their new standards, because crossing the Rubicon, as they have with President Trump, is a big deal.
Liberal Senator Andrew Bragg is one of more than 50 Labor, Liberal and Nationals MPs who have formed a bipartisan group aimed at making these social media giants accountable for their content.
The whole idea of this parliamentary group is that it would be, I imagine, there to foster a bipartisan sense around addressing the issues of what is reasonable content on social media.
But he also argues that regulation forcing social media platforms to publish or remove content should only be a last resort.
This is a private economy, so I think the idea that we would force a publisher to publish something is not the sort of system that we have. We wouldn't say to the Sydney Morning Herald, you have to publish something.
I think really it's for them to step up and realise that if they can't regulate themselves reasonably in a consistent and transparent and accountable fashion, then it will have to be done for them.
Australia is leading the world in regulating tech companies after a landmark Australian Competition and Consumer Report outlined a blueprint for bringing these groups to account. That report has led to the development of a news bargaining code, a disinformation code, changes to hate laws, and a review of the Privacy Act.
I think we in Australia have arrived at the right place. We're taking a really pragmatic approach. We don't think that you can arrest your way out of online abuse or regulate your way out of it.
The power of these tech titans remains vast and will be for years to come.
As a society, we have to work out ways of regulating and managing this power, consistent with freedom of speech, consistent with freedom of expression, but drawing the line at terrorism and incitement of violence.
Hi, I'm Lee Sales. Thanks for watching this story. If you'd like to watch more of 730's stories, they are on the left of your screen. And tap on the button below to subscribe and get the latest from ABC News.